Hello, it's Bruce Williams again. Today I'd like to do the fourth part of my series on the gross pathology of the eye and cover some metabolic and nutritional diseases of interest. As I do at the beginning of all of my lectures, I want to thank those folks who've made their images available to me either directly or through online collections and allow me to put these little lectures together. Here's a classic vitamin deficiency in turtles. When turtles were sold in pet stores in the late 60s and early 70s, we saw lots of cases of this, as well as a number of other vitamin deficiencies, because the food that was provided with them were little shakers of dried ants, which they willingly ate but provided very little nutrition. And one of the things that ants are very devoid of is vitamin A. And when you deprive an animal of vitamin A, especially some of the lower vertebrates, you get a change in the normal glandular epithelium of many different organs, including the lacrimal ducts and the lacrimal glands around the eyes, the glands of the esophagus, essentially any glandular tissue. And it changes from a glandular phenotype to a keratinized phenotype. Some people call this squamous metaplasia. It's not really a metaplastic disease because there's no irritation to the eyes, at least not initially, but it is a result of the deficiency of vitamin A. And so these animals have these crusty plugs covering the eyes due to keratin and resulting inflammation, because as you remember, the body does not like keratin in abnormal places. So I would call this squamous metaplasia of the orbital lacrimal ducts. This is an eye from my dog Tasha. She's gone now. She had a number of problems. She was a German Shepherd mix, and she got one of the diseases that are well known in German Shepherds and German Shepherd mixes, that of lipid keratopathy. Some people call it lipid keratitis, but there's not a whole lot of inflammation here. Lipid keratopathy is a syndrome of lipid deposition in the corneal stroma. It starts from the limbus of the eye and progresses in a circumferential pattern until the pupil, or the area of the cornea over the pupil, is the only part that's left, and eventually that will become opaque as well. Histologically, if you cut a section through here, you will see abundant free lipid, cholesterol clefts, and some macrophages that have made it in there to clean it up. Here you can see that she has tremendous amounts of neovascularization in the inflamed area. In addition to German Shepherds, this can also be seen in any breed that is hyperlipidemic, to include miniature schnauzers, as well as animals who have other forms of lipid dysregulation, such as animals with hypothyroidism, where you have a decreased activation of lipoprotein lipase. In early stages, some people might call this arcus lipoides, another term that you may hear. Another group of species that get a lipid keratopathy are amphibians, especially frogs and tree frogs. This condition is different than what we see in the dogs, but it is also the result of hypercholesterolemia. The source is usually what is known as gut-loaded crickets. One way to get a number of vitamins and minerals and other nutrients into frogs is to feed them to the crickets first. And this is what happens with frogs that are fed loaded crickets or mealworms who are fed on high-fat diets. The condition usually is a little worse in females, either with active follicles or totally atretic follicles, and it may be accompanied by lipid deposition or xanthomatosis in other areas of the frog, including the coelomic serosa and the meninges, and occasionally even gets into the brain. In frogs, lipid keratopathy should be differentiated from corneal mineralization. we see mineralization of the cornea of amphibians, both as a result of previous injury and dystrophic mineralization, or occasionally as a result of metastatic calcification, which is usually due to renal failure or very high levels of calcium in the diet. We are going to talk a lot more about cataracts in the next lecture, or possibly the one after that. But if we're talking about metabolic disease, we should talk about diabetic cataracts, which affect up to 70% of spontaneously diabetic dogs. The lens really has no blood supply, but it gets all of the glucose that it needs by absorption from the aqueous humor. As long as the animal is normal glycemic and there's an abundant production of aqueous humor, all is well with the lens of the dog. However, hyperglycemic or diabetic animals have high levels of glucose within their aqueous as well as within the circulating blood. The lens doesn't have a way to shut out glucose, so it will absorb high levels of glucose. Normally, glucose in the lens is fed into the Embden-Meyerhof pathway of anaerobic glycolysis to meet the energy needs of the dividing and stable epithelial cells of the lens. Hexokinase is an enzyme that's the rate-limiting step in the Embden-Meyerhof pathway, and when that becomes overwhelmed by the large amount of glucose that's being absorbed into the lens, the remaining glucose is shunted into the sorbitol pathway. The reduction of sorbitol within the lens is very slow, and the excess sorbitol will build up. And the excess amount of this particular solute draws water into the cells of the lens, resulting in rupture of these cells and ultimately cataract formation. If the diabetes is reversed in the early stages of these cataracts, the cataract itself may be reversed. Older cataracts, even if the diabetes is controlled, are irreversible. There is a similar problem which you may have heard of in young animals that are fed milk replacer, because a lot of milk replacers have high levels of galactulose, which is not broken down easily as well, accumulates in the lens, and may result in the formation of cataracts in very young kittens, dogs, and a number of other species, especially marsupials, who don't do well except on their mother's milk. Here is a cat with bronze eyes, and this is a well-known finding in portosystemic shunts, but nobody has a good reason for it. It is not the result of neovascularization, probably just normal congestion of the vessels of the iris. Once the portosystemic shunt is corrected, this color of the iris will disappear. I know that there is a market out here for these bronze-colored eyes in cats. Unfortunately, these cats don't last a whole long time after they develop it. There aren't a whole lot of toxicologic diseases that cause good growth signs. There are a number of agents that will affect various parts of the eye, including Baytril, which will occasionally in certain individuals cause a toxic retinopathy, but doesn't leave very good lesions. So I will show you what I have in my collection. This is a fairly common problem in chickens, and this either ulcer or band of mineralization in chronic cases is always present in the center of the eye. I think that this is probably an ulcer because there is concomitant conjunctivitis. The conjunctiva are very swollen, and this is what you see in chickens in which the ammonia levels in the litter are too high. You rarely will see lesions at the periphery of the eye because the eyelids cover that, and the central cornea is what is really exposed to these high levels of ammonia. Corneal damage begins with anything over 25 parts per million ammonia, and you can start to smell ammonia at 20 parts per million. And remember, you're much taller than the chicken, so if you can smell it at your height, it's probably much stronger at their height. The pathogenesis of ammonia toxicosis is actually quite interesting. Ammonia by itself doesn't do very much, but it combines with the water of the tear film to form ammonium hydroxide. And it doesn't really do much against the corneal epithelium. These lesions start with damage to the basement membrane after the ammonium hydroxide has been absorbed across the corneal epithelium. And then this damaged basement membrane will detach from the underlying stroma, taking the overlying corneal epithelium, which is intact and healthy, with it, and resulting in a corneal ulcer in the center of the eye. Animals that are taken to an area without ammonia will heal, and you will get a layer of mineralization in the regenerated basement membrane, which is known as calcific band keratopathy. Here is a mouse with an ulcer on its cornea as well, and this also may be due to high levels of environmental ammonia if the animal caretakers are not changing out the litter on a regular basis, or if there are too many mice that are grouped together. I would also consider a number of other possibilities for ulcerative keratitis in mice, including the possibility of ulceration due to previous anesthesia and nobody put any ointment in the eye, so the cornea has dried out. There are a couple of other toxins like diazinon, which has been caused corneal ulcers. Many times these ulcers are secondarily infected by the opportunist Staphylococcus aureus, which is omnipresent in these cages. This is not to say that it caused the lesions, as many people will interpret, but actually there's a predisposing factor for corneal ulcerations, and any bacteria or fungi that you culture from these probably are just taking advantage of a devitalized cornea. Well, that's it for toxicologic and metabolic and nutritional diseases of the eye. Starting with our next lecture, we will cover a wide range of miscellaneous and very interesting diseases of the eye in a number of species. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and please look for other lectures on the eye or other facets of gross pathology on the Foundation's Facebook page or YouTube channel. Thanks so much for your time and attention.